Willowbrook was the sort of town people passed through on the way to somewhere else. Quiet, hidden beneath a canopy of towering oaks and maples, nestled by a winding creek that glittered like silver in the sunlight. The kind of place where time seemed to stand still, where the seasons crept by unnoticed. No one expected anything to happen here. Not really. At least not until the birds arrived. It started small. A single crow perched on the telephone line outside the old Bailey house, its dark eyes following anyone who passed by. Then another arrived, and another. Soon, the sky above Willowbrook was blackened by thousands of crows, each one perched on rooftops, fences, and trees, watching the town with cold, unblinking stares. It wasn't unusual for the birds to flock to the area. Willowbrook had always had a fair number of birds, especially crows. But this was different. The crows didn't leave. They stayed, gathered in larger and larger numbers, their calls turning from curious to ominous. Then, the other birds joined in. The sparrows, the finches, even the robins, once a symbol of spring's arrival, now seemed to have caught the same strange malaise. They, too, gathered in thick, oppressive clouds that filled the air with their harsh, discordant cries. Miriam, the local librarian, was one of the first to notice it. She was used to the birds in the town. She had always been fond of their songs, the way they fluttered about in the morning light. But this was different.
They're not singing,
she said one morning, stepping out onto the porch of her little house on the edge of town. The birds didn't sing anymore. Instead, they screeched and cawed, their voices high-pitched and frantic, as if warning the town of something unspeakable. They would fly low over the streets, nearly brushing against the windows, their eyes glowing with something unnatural. Miriam's cat, Oscar, had been the first to go missing. She'd found him in the backyard, his body half-eaten, his fur torn and matted. The birds, she realized with a chill creeping down her spine, were not just passive observers. They were hunters. But it wasn't until a few days later that the sickness began. At first, it was only a few townsfolk, those who lived closest to the woods. A cough, a headache. They thought it was just a flu, or maybe allergies from the unusually harsh spring. But soon, the symptoms worsened. The fever hit first, then the violent coughing fits. People began to collapse in the streets, their bodies racked with spasms. Doctors couldn't figure out what was happening. There were no clear signs of infection, no cuts, no bites. But their faces grew pale, their breathing labored, and their eyes began to lose their gleam of life. Miriam was one of the last to succumb. The illness struck her late at night, the fever creeping up her spine like ice. She felt a chill in her bones, and her head pounded as if someone were hammering a drum inside her skull. She stumbled to the mirror, her hand clutched to her throat, trying to stifle the cough building in her chest. She saw nothing unusual at first, but then her reflection moved. It wasn't her face that looked back at her. It was something else. The eyes, dark and hollow, stared back with an unblinking, predatory gaze. Her heart pounded in her chest as the reflection grinned, revealing teeth that weren't hers. The reflection opened its mouth.
"You shouldn't have ignored us,"
it whispered. She stumbled backward, gasping for air, her vision blurring. The fever intensified, and the last thing she saw before collapsing was the caw of a crow perched on her windowsill. When Miriam awoke, she was no longer in her bed. Her body ached, and the air smelled thick, almost metallic. She was in the center of the town square, surrounded by the very birds that had caused all of this. Their eyes glowed in the dusk, filling the sky with their ominous presence. The streets were silent, eerily silent, except for the rustling of wings. She wasn't alone. The sick townsfolk, those who had fallen ill and died, had risen. They shuffled through the streets like puppets, their eyes glazed and lifeless. Their bodies moved in jerky, unnatural motions, mirroring the erratic flapping of the birds in the sky. As she looked at them, Miriam realized with growing horror that they weren't truly alive anymore. They were something else, something possessed. The townspeople weren't the only ones affected by the disease. It was spreading to the animals too. Horses, dogs, even the rats. All of them had fallen victim to the sickness, their bodies twitching as they too became part of this grotesque mockery of life. But it wasn't just the living creatures that had changed. The very land itself felt wrong. The trees were twisted, their branches gnarled and reaching out like skeletal hands. The creek that had once sparkled with life was now thick with algae and rotting leaves. The sky, which had been blue and bright, had turned a sickly shade of green, as if the entire town was being suffocated by some invisible force. And the birds, they weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting. Miriam realized then that the birds were not merely carriers of disease, they were its architects. They had been chosen to bring about this change, to usher in a new world where life and death were indistinguishable. The disease was not just in the body, it was in the soul, a curse older than time itself. With a horrified glance, Miriam saw the crows descend upon the town, landing in the square. They began to caw, their voices rising in a chorus, and she knew, with gut-wrenching certainty, that they were calling to something. Someone. A figure appeared on the horizon, tall and cloaked in shadow. It was the one who had been behind it all, the one who had unleashed the curse upon Willowbrook. The birds, now restless, circled overhead as the figure stepped forward, revealing a twisted skeletal face, its eyes glowing with an unnatural, ravenous hunger.
"You were never meant to survive,"
the figure whispered, its voice a low hiss that seemed to vibrate in her very bones.
"The birds, they are our messengers, and they have come to claim what is ours."
Miriam tried to scream, but no sound came from her lips. The birds fluttered closer, their wings a blur of blackness, their beaks clicking with the promise of death. Her body trembled, but she couldn't move. And as the birds descended upon her, Miriam knew that Willowbrook would never be the same again. The disease wasn't just a sickness, it was a transformation, a new world, built on the ruins of the old, a world ruled by the birds, and there was no one left to stop it. The town of Willowbrook fell silent. The wind howled, but there was no life left to hear it. The birds still circled, their wings casting long shadows across the broken streets, waiting. The last of the living had gone, leaving only the dead, the cursed, and the creatures of the sky. The disease had taken them all. And soon, the world beyond Willowbrook would know the same fate. The birds were coming, and they were never going to leave.